Tonight is a very special podcast here on The Room, the Transfer Room. I'm joined today by Alex Caddick, who is usually my co-host, but I'm also joined by an extremely special guest in Mo Chatra today. It's transfer deadline day, and we have managed to pull out one of the best football financial experts, shall we say, especially when it comes to Liverpool, in Mo Chatra. So I'm delighted to welcome both of you, obviously, and welcome to the show as well, Mo. The first time that you've actually been on The Room, the podcast brought to you by LFC Transfer Room. So how are you both? I'll start with Mo first. How are you today? It's a busy day and there's lots of business going on. How has it been?
Really, really good. Phone's just been draining away battery-wise, so I'll have to put it on charge again before long. So many messages, but no, it's all part of the fun of the transfer windows, isn't it? So in a way, kind of glad that it's coming to an end so we can focus on the more important stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, we haven't spoken since the Newcastle game. I'm sure you're delighted, as am I, and Mo with the 98th minute winner. How are you feeling?
Yeah, they left it late, didn't they? But it was a sweet one at that proper Anfield night. It felt like towards the end, and don't think there's a more appropriate day really to have Mo on than deadline day. With everything that goes on with transfers, so really looking forward to this edition of the pod.
Yeah, me too. And for those who aren't listening and perhaps aren't following your tremendous analysis of all things, not just Liverpool, but the financial aspects behind them, tell us how you became interested in football finance as a whole, and in particular Liverpool's.
Sure. So obviously, needless to say, I am a Liverpool fan, have been for more years than I care to mention. But I'm also a chartered accountant. My actual job, so away from Twitter and social media and other things, does involve finance, and it'd been something I'd taken a growing interest in, especially under the ownership of FSG. There'd been a lot of scrutiny after they came in, and even before they came in, about the club's finances. Obviously, the club's on its knees from a financial sense, and even on the pitch. Back in 2010. Rafa had gone, the Hodge had come in, our recruitment was abysmal. We were talked about as being on the verge of administration. So it was really dark times. And, I took an interest in why is this? How has this happened? How can one of the great clubs of not only English football, but about world football, European football, be in such a difficult position? So, I started taking more of an interest in the finance side of football, and that interest just grew over time. And I started to research it, looking into how certain things work within football finance, and then eventually started to tweet about it as well. And that kind of got some interest. But it wasn't just about reading up on it. It was also talking about people that are involved in football and the kind of football finance side and the deals that are done, and looking at the commercial side and football contracts, talking to lawyers and others, so really developing a really sound understanding from the inside about how it all works.
I think people forget actually those dark days under Hicks and Gillette, where it was literally, like you said, on the verge of bankruptcy. What they managed to do to Liverpool Football Club. It was very, very close. And I know that time has evolved since then. Social media has just taken off, and you only have to log on to Twitter and search, FSG, and half of the hashtags, if not even more so, especially, probably now, is FSG out. But listen, I'm not an FSG out person. I think that they've done wonders to the club. And I think actually it goes without saying that to a certain extent, they did save Liverpool. Now, I'd love for them to spend more money on transfers, etc. And we'll get onto that later. But I mean, how big of an impact did FSG have when they came in to Liverpool Football Club?
Well, I mean, they clearly came in at absolutely the right time. If they hadn't come in at that point, worst case would have been that we potentially could have gone into administration. I don't think that we would have disappeared off of the face of the football globe. We would have somehow survived in some form or fashion. But that, survivor may have involved dropping down the tiers, worst case, in the way that happened to Rangers. Rangers went into administration had to be demoted all the way down to the bottom of the football pyramid in Scotland. And, after several seasons, they managed to get back up to the Scottish Premiership. And obviously how that happened to Liverpool, that would have been, not even worth thinking about. So it was good that, they helped us to avoid that situation and steady the ship financially. These people, especially John W. Henry, have a finance background. He has a hedge fund background. So, he's all about making sure that, the numbers all stack up. And perhaps later on we'll come on to whether he focuses a bit too much on making sure things are sound financially at the expense of risk-taking, which interestingly Jurgen Klopp, made a few comments about. And as I say, we'll perhaps come on to that later. But, since then they've steadied the ship, and under their ownership, we have seen Anfield expand and is expanding. We've moved training ground, Melwood, which had been our base since the 50s, and expanded Kirkby, our academy centre, to accommodate, the academy as well as the first team. And we have a magnificent facility there. We have also seen fine growth in terms of revenue under their ownership as well. And, we are now generating more income than all but a small handful of clubs in world football. So, and ultimately we have won the league, the Champions League, and various other competitions in the last several years under their watch. On top of that, recruitment has improved significantly on the pitch, off the pitch. They brought in Jurgen Klopp. They pulled off somewhat of a master stroke, I think, in appointing Michael Edwards to his post. At the time, I was very skeptical. I thought, well, this is one of the analytic guys. He is great at maybe identifying talent off of a spreadsheet or a database. How good is he going to be negotiating a deal with a super agent like a George Mendes? And yet, a couple of years later, George Mendes was, putting money towards a GoFundMe for Edwards running a marathon or something like that. So, he developed that relationship, and I was skeptical he could even do such a thing. So there's all these things that they've done, which has been very good. On the flip side, there's also been, failures and failings as well. And this is one of the things that, as great as Twitter can be, it doesn't really allow for, which is nuance and, balanced discussion. It has to be black and white. You're either in or you're out. There's no in between. And this is where I stand. I'm dispassionate about the owners in the sense that, whilst I appreciate what they did 12 years ago, it nonetheless is 12 years ago. I want them to do what's best for the club. And I think on the whole, they try to do that. Sometimes, though, some of their actions or inactions maybe aren't always doing what is best for the Liverpool Football Club. And that sometimes creates frustration, not only for fans, but even, as we saw from the comments in the last week, for the manager himself.
Yeah, I mean, FSG is a complete minefield, and especially it will be after today if a loan signing is perhaps the only signing. But again, we can get onto that later. Whilst information about club finances is or does tend to be out in the public for most to see, we see yourself and Swiss Ramble are good accounts to follow on Twitter. Not many research it as well as what you do, Mo. So how long does it take for you to put all of these figures together until you release that thread that you do so well detailed? How long does it take for you to research these things?
So it does take a while. And, when it comes to numbers and factual information, you want to make sure that the numbers that you're putting out there is as accurate as possible. Now, there are misconceptions about club accounts, and pretty much every summer now for the last 3 or 4 summers, fans have been arguing back and forth about what the accounts do or don't prove. So you'll have those that support the ownership and feel that they are being criticised unfairly, who will say, well, the accounts show exactly where all the money goes. No, it doesn't actually. At a high level, there is a breakdown of the income and the expenditure. but it is not as detailed as you think. So, if somebody, for example, pulled out the Manchester United accounts, because they are their shares are floated on the New York Stock Exchange, there are rules and regulations in place that require their accounts that are published linked to that to be far more detailed than our accounts. So I will produce information and analysis based on the accounts, but the accounts themselves are relatively limited in what they do tell you. And it's the same for, Swiss Ramble, who is, I would argue, the preeminent account on Twitter for football finance. And as great as his analysis is as well, with things like wages, for example, we will see that Liverpool Football Club in the 2021 season spent £314 million, which is a huge amount of money on wages. But where exactly did that go? How much of that was the basic wages? So we hear about, like Mo Chatra, his new contract being $350,000 a week, other players on $200,000 a week, 150, whatever it might be. But if you tot up those figures that are widely reported for the first team squad, you only get to about 130, 140 million. So how do we go from that all the way up to 314? And that, again, is a question that is debated. Well, where's all this money going? And I've put out threads about that as well in the past to say, well, as best as I can, based on the limited information available, okay, on top of that, you've got payments for tax. And, we have more than just football players. We have coaching staff. We have people that work in marketing, in finance, in IT. We're a club which has nearly 900 employees or slightly more than that. And that's on top of the 2,000 that work on a match day, whether it's serving a hot dog or, working as stewards on, within the ground or outside the ground. So there's all these different things that, are factors. So in answer to your question, a very long-winded way of saying, there's a lot of time that goes in to analysing the accounts and also looking at other clubs' accounts as well, because you can learn something about the way Liverpool's finances work based on reading, for example, Manchester United's accounts, which, as I say, are a bit more detailed because of the fact that they are publicly traded.
It's really interesting, actually, when you mention the wages, because people would just read that and think, okay, well, that's just for the playing staff. It's just for the players. So it's a really interesting point that you made there. I think that's something for, because I wouldn't have thought of that, for instance. It's everybody involved with it. That's everybody's wage at Liverpool Football Club. It's not that first 22 players, etc., in that first team squad. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, so obviously the whole operation of managing finances, as you just said, it's not just the players, it's staff from top to bottom. It's obviously a very structured, a structured way of doing it. But in terms of 2 or 3 years ago when the pandemic hit, just how did that affect football and in particular Liverpool financially? And then on top of that, have we now recovered from them effects?
Good question. So obviously we've been dealing with the effects of the pandemic since March 2020. So this was the tail end of the 1920 season when we won the Premier League. Now that season, we missed out on 4 home games. We unfortunately had been knocked out of Europe just before we went into lockdown. Thank you, Adrian. And we still had nonetheless 4 Premier League games left, and that cost us that season about 11-12 million pounds. On top of that, there was money for TV, Premier League, and even some Champions League money that still had to come in, which only came in the following year, 2021. So in 1920, we did take a hit because of missing out on 4 home games. And on top of that, other money to conclude the season falling into the next financial year, which was the 2020-21 financial year. Now, that was a season where we took a bigger hit because we went pretty much a whole season without fans attending matches. Obviously, there was small pockets of the season when I think it was 2,000 fans were allowed into Anfield. in a typical season, we would generate about 84, 85 million pounds from match day revenue. I think for that season, it was about £1 million from memory off the top of my head. So we took a hit of over £80 million just from the fact that there were pretty much no fans attending matches for the entirety of that season. On top of that, commercial. So we have a fantastic store outside of Anfield, which on a match day, for those that have been, is absolutely ram-packed. And even outside of match days, there's a brisk amount of business that goes on, with tours of the stadium, fans coming in from all over the world, and then going into the club shop, the mega store to pick up various merchandise. And again, that suffered on the commercial front. But all told, we took a hit of about £100 million. So that was money that could have gone towards signing players, reducing the debt on the main stand loan that had come through. Just to be clear about that, one of the common misconceptions again around that is the owners lent the club the £110 million to deliver that stand. That is sort of true, but not entirely. FSG borrowed money from funders, they at a low interest rate, and then lent the money at no interest to the club. So it came money coming into FSG onto the club then repaying that loan. So that money came in. The work finished around 2017. We paid off about 48 million of that. But once the pandemic came along, for 2021, we didn't reduce that loan at all because of the fact that we were taking a massive hit of 80 plus million pounds. So we potentially, from the season just gone, when obviously we had fans back in attendance and match day revenue was pretty much back to normal, we would, I think, have repaid some of that loan back. And during that period, we also saw the completion of Kirby, which is now known as the AXA Training Complex. And we, in the season just gone, at the tail end, started the expansion of the Annie Road end, which again is a big, costly undertaking of about £80 million. That said, the club in 2021 did take out additional borrowing. So I believe that stand is being dealt with through that loan and not from club finances, and certainly not from any money that is coming directly from FSG.
It's interesting that you speak about Liverpool's infrastructure, because in your latest thread on the 24th of August, you stated that Liverpool's infrastructure spend is a red herring, which is no doubt where perhaps FSG or the media figures will point to where Liverpool's money have gone this window, because we see it. We saw it last night, even with the Newcastle match. You saw all the cranes going over and the stands getting built. Could you, what's your reason behind saying it's a red herring? I mean, it's obviously money that is coming out of the club, but surely there is a way of perhaps doing both, of bringing players in and also doing that. We've seen it with Spurs, we've seen it with Arsenal in the past too.
Totally, yeah. So this is where it gets a little bit frustrating for me, because we are now into the fourth summer in a row of what I would argue is being modest spend relative to some of or most of our rivals. 2019, we come off winning the Champions League. Our marquee signing in that window was Sepp van den Berg. A young kid that nobody had heard about from Germany, albeit highly touted, and we heard that Bayern Munich was interested in him. We brought in obviously Adrian on a free, Andy Lonergan, remember him, on a free, and young Harvey Elliott. He wasn't brought in on a free, though we only agreed his transfer fee a year or two later, and he came in as a 15, 16-year-old, really, really young. So we obviously, as a fan base, were massively frustrated. And at the start of that window, John W. Henry came out and said, we will go out and spend to give Jurgen Klopp the resources he needs to go that one bit further in the Premier League, because obviously we agonisingly missed out on the title at the end of that season by, I think it was a point. So come summer 2020, we think, okay, Mbappe 2020, that was the hashtag. Came and went, didn't happen. And people all put it down to, well, we're in lockdown, this pandemic has come along, it's ruined our plans. Had it not happened, Mbappe would have been ours. I don't really think that would have been the case, to be honest. Even by that point, the player would have been expecting wages well in excess of our wage structure. So there's always, as excited as some fans were betting, even I thought, oh yeah, imagine Mbappe alongside Matty and Mo. But I think realistically that was a non-starter. 2021 then. So we're talking last summer. We again didn't do much business. We obviously brought in Ubu Konate early in the window. We saw Gini Wijnaldum go on a free. We all thought surely we're going to replace him. We need a midfielder. A couple of the stalwarts in midfield, Henderson and Milner, are not getting any younger. We came to the end of the window a year ago and the midfielder didn't come in. And we thought, surely now, after 3 years of not really spending all that much, summer 22, surely we're going to go big. And it all started very promisingly with Nunes coming in, a couple more signings in Carvalho and Ramsey. And as it has emerged, Tchouaméni would have come in had it not been for him changing his mind and Real Madrid feeling a bit butthurt over missing out on Mbappe, and then deciding, right, we've got to spend that money somewhere else. And
Mbappe's done us twice now, Kylian Mbappe, I blame. Twice. Yeah. Not just summer 2020 for breaking our hearts, but also this summer for the Tchouaméni transfer too.
Exactly. So, yeah, all of this, unfortunately has resulted in 4 years of moderate kind of spend. So, it has caused frustration, and it has, seen fans asking the question, well, where is this money going? If we're unable to spend, is it for, and some silly conspiracy theories as well. Let's face it, fans say, oh, well, we're, the owners are leeching, siphoning money out of the club and all this stuff. Now, infrastructure, we have obviously spent, but the loan, as I mentioned, we've only spent about £40 million up until at the end of the summer 21 season, starting from 2017. So in 4 years, we'd only spent 47 million in total, reducing that loan. And on top of that, as I mentioned, the Annie Road expansion only started a few months ago. And, that is being funded by a loan. That is not being funded from the revenue that the club is generating. It's not being funded from owner investment. So then the only other asset that has been delivered has been Kirby, and that cost £56 million. Now, that is money that has been funded by money generated by the club itself. So the money generated from Champions League, Premier League, commercial, match day, all of that is paid for that. So we didn't take out any borrowing for that. But my point was, look at that compared to some of the other clubs. Look at Tottenham Hotspur. They have delivered a £1 billion brand new stadium. And yet, that was delivered, some 2-3 years ago. And that has not curtailed their spending. And part of it is that their ownership has taken a slightly different approach to managing finances. Up until then, the Tottenham Hotspur fan base used to get very frustrated with the chairman, Daniel Levy, and also the owner, Joe Lewis, over what they perceived to be lack of ambition and not backing managers. And, they could have easily decided, right, we've got a massive debt to repay. linked to this stadium. Let's put all of our money into that. Instead, they said, look, let's try and pay it off over as long a period as possible to then allow enough funds to pay for other things, such as increasing our wages. Tottenham Hotspur's wage bill is significantly below that of the likes of Liverpool, United City and others. And, they said, okay, let's try and address this by backing Antonio Conte. To that end, the owners have actually taken out borrowing, injected it into the club as equity. What that means is that the owner has put money in for the first time, albeit it's a loan. So that money will have to be repaid. And it might be that he'll look to Spurs to repay that loan in the same way that Liverpool's owners have looked to the club to repay the main stand loan. But the point being, we absolutely 100% have it in our gift to deliver these infrastructure improvements as well as investing in the squad. It didn't have to be one or both, one or the other. That is simply not the case. So anyone that argues that when a club like Liverpool is generating 580 million or more for the season just gone, it is simply not being realistic about the situation.
You've spoke about Liverpool's lack of willingness to spend on signing players, as well as obviously infrastructures and things like that. And perhaps they've tried to mask that sort of thing with contract extensions and that coinciding with football becoming more lucrative by the year. How will that point towards, firstly, Liverpool, having a higher wage structure than ever? And then what does that do in terms of turnover? How does that affect Liverpool in terms of turnover, having the wage structure as high as ever?
So the wage structure has seen a massive increase. So if we go back to about 5 years ago, the wage bill used to be about 208 million. And within a couple of years, it had grown by 50%. So it had gone to about 300 million. And my estimation is that for the season just finished, 21-22, I believe it will be in and around the 350 million pound mark, perhaps just slightly under that. So it will be higher than it has ever been. Now, that is in large part due to the fact that the club operates incentivized contracts. So most clubs, especially the top clubs, do have incentivized contracts. Even if you go down to the non-leagues, there'll be players on goal bonuses. Their bonus might only be 20 quid, but there'll be nonetheless a bonus involved. Obviously, the amounts for Premier League players, and especially for Liverpool players, significantly more. Now, what it means is that the more we spend on wages, the less money potentially we then have to spend on other things like transfers. So one of the things that, again, people that have been backing and supporting the ownership when it comes to discussion about a lack of spending in the transfer market is they've said, well, look, one of the reasons we're not spending as much on transfers is because the club is investing more on wages to retain players. One of the common complaints up until a few years ago was that Liverpool Football Club was a stepping stone, that players like Suarez, for example, were using it to then get a move to a bigger club. We saw it before him with, Xabi Alonso, again, coming into Liverpool, using it to then move on to Real Madrid. And in recent years, we've seen that Liverpool has gone from being a stepping stone to a destination club. And part of that is paying players what they feel that they are worth. So, people will hear reports about, our wage structure is pretty tight and we're only paying up to 200,000 a week. And other clubs like United are paying, inferior players, 300, 350,000 a week. Why is that? But then if you look at the overall wage bill, where our wage bill is not all that dissimilar to United. And part of that is because whereas they guarantee more money for their players, less incentivization, we've got heavy incentivization. So that has in turn helped us to generate the amount of turnover that we have. I would argue we have seen us generate 533 million in the season when we won the Champions League in 18-19, which was absolutely massive. You go back only about 2 years prior to that, those levels of turnover were 300 million, 360 million, way less. So it's linked, you see. Wages, the more success that there is on the pitch, the more that the players are paid. And the more success they have on the pitch, the more income we will generate. In contrast, if we have an absolute nightmare of a season, this season, fall out of the top four, end up in the Europa League, those bonus payments to these players will be reduced significantly. So the wage bill will come down as turnover will come down. So that is the way that FSG have set it up. And I think on the whole, that works pretty well. What it does mean is that some of these superstar signings that we could potentially make, the club generally won't make them. We saw that they were very reluctant, really, to ultimately agree a deal for Mo Salah, which was outside of the standard wage structure. You know, his 350,000 a week that's reported is well above, you know, all of the other players. But the argument is, you know, he is a bona fide world-class player, one of the top players in the world. So if we're going to make an exception to that structure for anyone, it's the guy that has, you know, won 3 golden boots out of 4. And that has played a massive part in us winning some of the trophies that we have.
In terms of the elephant in the room, I mean, we've briefly spoken about transfers, but it is transfer deadline day. We're recording this around about 7:30 now. It's clear to everyone that Liverpool need a midfielder. Now, it looks like that might happen in Arthur Melo coming in on loan. But it looks to me like they're seemingly waiting for Jude Bellingham. And that's like the worst kept secret in football. Who would cost in excess of anywhere between 100, 120 million. There are actually reports as well, depending on what you read online, 146 million. Is it a case of Klopp saving his war chest this summer for Jude next summer? So has he got a set budget this year? He's going to say, actually, well, we can't get Jude Bellingham this summer. I don't want to waste money this summer. I'm going to save it all for next summer and bring in a Jude Bellingham type player. Or can actually Liverpool go out and, like we saw with Tchouaméni, go out and get somebody? Does it have to be the right fit? Does it have to be Jude Bellingham? Or can he perhaps, like in January, go and get a Bellingham and somebody else perhaps? Is it the fact that Klopp is saving his war chest for Bellingham or a like player? Because we know Madrid are in for him too. That's certainly what it looks like. And not too many players, as we saw with Tchouaméni, turned down Real Madrid over Liverpool. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about this summer? It's quite clear we need a midfielder. Essentially, why haven't we gone out to get one? Is it the fact that he is waiting?
He is. That's right. But with this situation, right, so let's start, and I'll try and keep it brief, with the Tchouaméni situation. So way back around that time that deal started to fall apart, I put out a tweet which said, you know, we don't need to sell to buy. You know, in fact, our finances are such that we can perhaps make 2 marquee signings this summer without the need to sell to buy. And, you know, if you look at what has come out in recent days, you know, we were clearly in for Tchouaméni. That deal was far more advanced than most people realize. You know, it was very, very, very far advanced. And ultimately, he had a change of mind once Real Madrid came in, which is fair enough. You know, all players are entitled to that. We saw the flip side of that in January when Spurs thought they had Diaz. We came in and we, you know, snatched him from under their noses. So, you know, we've done it to clubs and, you know, clubs do it to us. That's the nature of football. But what that showed is that the funds were there. The owners had sanctioned that deal. They were happy for Liverpool Football Club to go out and spend, you know, 60 million or more on bringing Tchouaméni in alongside Nunez. That deal was also far advanced, even though obviously that deal concluded several weeks later. So we had absolutely the intention to give Klopp what he wanted, Tchouaméni and Nunez. And at the same time, yes, we wanted to move certain players on, and we knew that certain players wanted to leave, like Sadio Mane. We'd known that for a year. But even with the sales, we still would have comfortably exceeded the money that would have come in. And the club was happy to do that because they would generate, as I've mentioned before, £580 million in turnover. So is there a budget? Yes, there is. And after the Tchouaméni deal fell through, Klopp wanted Jude Bellingham, but at the same time, he knew, Liverpool Football Club knew, it would have been extremely difficult to prize Bellingham away from Borussia Dortmund. They are a club that have become a selling club for the true top players around Europe in recent years. That's how they make their money. It is very rare for them to sell two marquee players in the same window. So they lost Haaland right at the beginning. That deal was pretty much done and dusted a long time ago. You know, it was something that was, again, the worst kept secret up until that point in football. Everyone knew Haaland was going to go to Manchester City, and they knew that for quite some time. So we should have known at that point the chances of prizing Bellingham away from Dortmund this summer were very slight. And this is where the comments from Klopp in the last week become very interesting, because he expressed frustration about the owners. He said, look, words to the effect of, you know, sometimes, you know, I'd like people to be a bit, take some risks, be less risk averse. And what he meant by that, as far as I'm concerned, and what a lot of people of the same view, is that he really, really wanted Jude Bellingham this summer. And if the price was right for Borussia Dortmund, they would have been willing to sell this summer. So I think that is what his frustration comes down to. The fact that he felt, look, I know as a Liverpool manager that my former club wants silly money for Jude Bellingham. But I think if we're going to pay silly money for anyone, and we generally don't, but if we're going to pay for one player, that is the player that I want us to spend that silly money on. And I think that is where that was basically at the heart of those comments from him. He was frustrated, clearly, and some of that came out in that press conference the other day. And look, there would have been a budget, and the money that I think would have been enough for Dortmund to change their mind and let him go this summer would have been in excess of the budget. And I think that the owners felt, look, you know, we can't commit to that, A, because it's over budget, even though we could have, without question, in my view, found a way to make the deal happen. But also, they are very, very loath to pay significantly over the odds for players, and they will walk away from deals if they feel clubs are asking for silly money. And that's just something, if you look at the transfer deals that we've done over the last, 5-6 years especially, that's just something that the owners generally don't sanction. So, it was just an unfortunate thing. I really cannot blame the owners in this transfer window for that lack of spend. I think it was more just down to a difference of opinion where, they felt, look, we've got a model that works for us, rightly or wrongly, in the manager's view. The manager wanted us to push the boat out. So he was frustrated with them. I suspect they were slightly frustrated with him. And ultimately, the Bellingham deal didn't happen. And so we've ended up bringing in really what is a stopgap, even though, if you listen to journalists close to the club, they'll all tell you, oh, Liverpool don't do stopgaps. And yet here we are signing a stopgap this evening.
Yeah, and for me, just talking about Bellingham, because he's just been everywhere this summer, especially with Liverpool fans, do you not think perhaps it might be a risk that actually that, let's say, 120 million that was quoted, is going to be worth more than that after a good World Cup and perhaps another consistent season with Borussia Dortmund, and also the interest from, let's say, City and Madrid? Is that not going to actually drive that price tag up? Was it perhaps a little bit risky to say, no, we'll spend that money next summer and you can have Bellingham next summer, but he might even cost anywhere between 150, 160, depending on how well he does this year, especially on a World Cup year? So is that not also a bit of a risk from FSG, because then Klopp's certainly not going to get him next year?
That's correct. I mean, the only reason I can speculate as to why they felt, look, let's not push the boat out far too much this summer, is that there might be a clause in his contract which caps the basically like a release clause, in the same way that we saw with Haaland. We know that his transfer fee for this summer was set at around £55 million. And obviously, Man City have had to pay significant sums of money to the agency that represents him, to his father, probably to the dog, various other people associated with the player. But nonetheless, I think that that's the only explanation I can think of, because you're absolutely right. You know, he is bound to have another strong season for Dortmund. And on top of that, you know, he will go into the World Cup without question. And you know, we'll hope that he performs well. And if he does, that surely would only add to his valuation. So, you know, is it a case of, well, spending 120 now rather than 150, 160 next summer? I think that the only rational explanation for me is that there must be a reason as to why that is. I feel that there's something in his contract which means that he can go for less, and substantially less. I think had that not been the case, we would have found a way, even though we might have felt it's over the odds to pay that much on a midfielder, to have brought him in this summer instead, because it was very clear Klopp wanted him. And again, you know, we know that Matthias Nunes desperately wanted to come to Liverpool, and he waited and he waited and he waited. And, you know, from you know, all that we've heard, it was Klopp. It was Klopp that was saying no. And again, he made comments to basically say, look, I was wrong about needing a midfielder. So, you know, all the indications are, you know, there were players presented to him. Okay, what about this guy? What about that guy? No, it's one player that I want. That's Jude. If it's Jude, it's Jude or nothing for me. And it almost became a bit of a who blinks first between him and the ownership. And, you know, that's where we ended up, like where we are today, where we're bringing in a player on loan.
With that said, I think everyone's certain this is the stopgap. Arthur Melo looks like it's about to be certain any time now that he does move. But it is a loan deal, and I think the finances of a loan deal, they aren't really discussed as much for obvious reasons as a permanent signing. So I was just wondering if you could provide us with some insight regarding the finances involved in loan signings.
Sure. So, you know, typically with these types of deals, you know, the loan signings are usually for a year. Occasionally you do get 2-year loan deals as well. I believe this one will be just for a single season, no option to buy, is my understanding. So it would, in all likelihood, just be a single payment that will be made, you know, today, in the case of Arthur Melo. And, you know, that will be pretty much it. I mean, again, sometimes with loan deals, there are agreements reached about wages, whereby the club that holds the contract may pay part of the player's wages. So we've seen that in the past, where certain players, like a Manchester United player, may have been sent out on loan to a smaller club, and yet United have footed, you know, a fair chunk of the wage bill for that player. That shouldn't be the case in this situation. You know, that should be fairly straightforward. We should be paying all of the wages. There likely will be some agents' commission involved as well as part of this loan deal as well. So, relatively speaking, compared to had we been signing the player on a permanent deal, where the permanent deal would have involved several payments. So we would have made an initial payment now, and then likely 2 more payments over subsequent years. So maybe one next summer, and then final payment the summer after. Permanent deals typically are paid in installments. Some deals, though, you do see more paid up front and lesser payments paid in later installments. And on the flip side, like the Diogo Jota deal, that was a low initial payment. That was in the height of the pandemic 2 years ago. But then we paid more in subsequent installments, summer 21 and likely this summer this summer. So we should have now paid off Diogo Jota. But typically that's how a loan deal works.
It's really interesting because you've said as well, the money's there for transfers. Klopp went on to say he wasn't sure if the right player was there. We've touched on that with Matthias Nunes and, other midfielders that might have been presented to him that he obviously didn't want. But it's quite a risk that Oxlade-Chamberlain, Naby Keita, James Milner, Bobby Firmino are all out of contract next summer, amongst others. So would you say that Liverpool are leaving themselves in a slightly precarious position, not just on the pitch with losing these players, but also financially too? Because even to replace 2 or 3 of those players is going to be a costly effort to do.
Completely, yeah. And that was at the heart of my thread that I put out last week, because I feel that, we got to a point by summer 2019 or the end of the 18-19 season where we had a really strong squad. We missed out on the league by a point, sure, but, we were relentless that season. We won the Champions League. The age profile of that squad was really good. Most of our players were, between 25 and 28, 29. And, there was a great amount of energy in that squad. And then after that, summer 2019, for all intents and purposes, we didn't bring in any strong, first team players. The following summer, yes, we did in Jota and Thiago. Summer 21, it was really only Konate. Last January, we brought in Diaz. And then in this window, we have brought in 2 or 3 too. But for me, we should have been doing a bit more business, and we should have been looking at succession planning in a more proactive way. And had we done that, we wouldn't end up in a situation where our midfield is comprised of players that are either too injury prone or past their peak. One of the key tenets of this transfer kind of model that we have in place is that you bring in players, just as they're about to come into their peak, and then get their best years out of them, and then move them on just as they're coming off those peak years, but whilst they still hold some value. And that, I would say, is one of my main criticisms of the club, is that we have allowed players to go on freeze or, with only a year left on their contract, and perhaps in some cases held on to players for too long. So, Bobby Firmino, for example, has been, very good, roll back the years, the last 2 games, fantastic, over the weekend. But, clearly his best days are past him. Now, either this summer or even last summer, and it would be an unpopular opinion with some, who, are very fond of Bobby, and, I am as well. But, looking at it from a pure business perspective, we've had his best years. And say if we'd sold him last summer, we could still have gotten probably £40 million for him. Even this window, with a year left on his contract, he's 30 years old. We could still have got some club to, spend 25, 30 million. If you look at other clubs and the deals that they've done, that they managed to get, really good money for some of their players. So I think with his reputation, we could still have generated, a good amount of money. There's no contract that's been signed to extend his deal. He could go on a free next year, and no money comes in for a player that at his peak was probably worth 70, 80 million for us only, 2 years ago. So this is where I think the lack of spend, and I'm not saying we should have been signing 5, 6 players every summer. Absolutely not. When you have a strong squad, it's just about, bringing through a healthy turnover of, top players and having good succession planning. But that involves moving players out. And if you don't move players out, then the spaces are not there to then bring the players in. And I think that is where, one of the criticisms I've heard of Klopp, I would perhaps share, is that, maybe he is a bit too loyal to players and wants to retain them for longer than perhaps he should. And James Milner, as great as he is in certain respects, he on the pitch can still do somewhat of a job. But when we're looking at winning the Premier League, trying to win, rack up 95 points, have Manchester City got the same kind of player? No, that they move those types of players on and they replace them. And I think that would be one of my frustrations about how we've operated, that we've now left ourselves in a situation where we could be losing 3 midfielders next summer on a free, and having to replace all of them. And the player that we are bringing in this window, we cannot extend into a permanent deal. So, that's leaving us with an awful lot to do. Potentially on top of that, Firmino going and finding a replacement for him, and even 1 or 2 other positions. We could see Tsimikas decide, well, look, despite my best efforts, I'm not getting a chance. I want to play regular football. He could go, and then we need to find a replacement for it. So we're leaving ourselves with a lot to do next summer. And if we're talking about spending 120 million or more on Jude Bellingham, are we going to have the money to then replace some of these others? So that is why I'm concerned that, by doing a comparative lack of business over the last few summers, it's leaving us with a huge amount of work to do next summer, which we may not be able to afford.
So with next summer, it looks like Liverpool may be perhaps losing a few who are surplus to requirements, but in previous years, we've had a real struggle of retaining key, crucial players. And for me personally, I think the contract renewal with Mohamed Salah was a big turning point in Liverpool getting rid of this idea of being a stepping stone club, especially after the recent trophy success. So I was just wondering how important were the sales of, Coutinho, Suarez, even way back to like Alonso, like you mentioned earlier in the podcast. How important were them sales in order to help elevate Liverpool to a point where they're competing on all fronts?
Yeah, I think that certainly sales have historically played quite a key role. If you look at the most notable one, the sale of Phil Coutinho, that enabled really us to bring in Van Dijk in January 18, and then Alisson, a few months later. And those were the differences to being contenders to championship caliber in terms of our squad. We needed that real bit of quality in those 2 key positions at centre back and in goal, to add that little bit that we were missing before they arrived. We by that point obviously become a top 4 team, but we needed to invest, and that is where, again, I say, look, recruitment made a massive difference then, and it can make a big difference to us now. But that was predicated on bringing the sales through. I think we're getting to a point though where we don't have to be as reliant on sales. We are generating huge amounts of turnover, and I think that by maintaining those levels and growing them as well, we're going to be making more money with Anfield Road and expanding. That will be generating another 10-15 million a year. On top of that, we will be hopefully striking better commercial deals. So we've got the sleeve sponsorship deal that renews in a year, and the new standard charter deal comes into effect in a year, which will be paying out even more money than it currently is. So all these additional sources of funding can all be used to fund transfer activity. And I think we'll need all the money we can generate next summer, because it feels very much like we've got a lot of business to do. Potentially 3 or 4 midfielders, potentially a forward, and even 1 or 2 other gaps in the squad may have to be addressed. So, if we're not bringing in, a good 5 or 6 players next summer, we could be going into 23, 24 with a really, really old group of players. And, with the intensity that we often hear about, that Pep Lijnders like to talk about, that kind of intensity, I feel, is maintained by a squad of a certain age profile. And if, half your squad is 30 or older, which it will be in 2023 season going in, I'm not convinced that squad will be able to maintain the kind of required energy levels and intensity that makes us play at our absolute best.
And when you talk about intensity, we saw it, or have seen it throughout this season. Perhaps the most intense player on that pitch at the moment is a 19-year-old Harvey Elliott, who has fresh legs, as opposed to as opposed to the older players. And that's no coincidence. You know, you need fresh legs to be playing that Gegenpress or whatever pressing system that Jurgen Klopp wants to call it. I'm going to go on to 5 quick fire questions, and you don't have to give any justifications. It is literally gut punch feeling. Favourite ever player for Liverpool?
Suarez.
Okay. Favourite moment as a Liverpool fan?
2005 Champions League.
Okay, well, this might feed in. Favourite goal?
Oh, so many to choose from.
I know, it's hard.
Gerrard Olympiacos.
Yeah, I thought you might say that. It's always that one for me, or strangely enough, the Mo Salah against Manchester United, where he takes his top off the alley assist, because at that moment I thought we've won the league. One player at their peak ever to bring back to Liverpool. It could be anybody who's played for Liverpool. One player at their absolute peak to bring back. It doesn't have to be a midfielder because we need a midfielder. It could be absolutely anybody. Who would you love to see again play for Liverpool at their peak?
I'd have to go Suarez again. You know, Suarez in that front line, goodness, the 13-14 Suarez, blimey, that was one of the great seasons for any player, not just for Liverpool, but for any club. So putting that 13-14 Suarez into this group, my word.
Unbelievable. And finally, one player to sign in January. Realistically, we know about it's not going to happen, etc. But like one player, sort of realistically, I suppose you can have a dream signing to sign in January.
It'd have to be a midfielder. I'm going to go with Jude.
I think that's perfectly fine.
Yeah. I mean, yes, he's not absolute top tier, but you know, I'm thinking about, you know, we need somebody to come in and carry us for years to come. And, you know, he's such an exciting young player, such a smart cookie as well. You know, if you listen to him, you know, you'd never think he's 19 years old. So, you know, he can really carry us forward for many, many years. And sorry, I'm giving a long-winded answer now. You know, there are better players out there at this moment in time that play in midfield. But I think he'll become, you know, top tier, you know, within next to no time. And already for me, he's becoming exceptionally strong.
We saw it with Van Dijk. If Klopp's willing to wait for somebody, then they've got to be quite special. You know, if he's stubborn enough to refuse the whole world of midfielders and wait for Jude Bellingham, he's going to have to be special, because he did that with Van Dijk too. Thank you so much for this podcast. It's been so insightful, and I've always loved throughout the years reading your threads on Liverpool and the finances behind the club. Give yourself a plug, really. Like, where can people find you? Where should they go to hear more of this like amazing analysis?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to come on here to begin with. So people can find me on Twitter. That's where I'm most busiest in terms of social media, and my handle's on screen. And I also put out a football finance podcast for Anfield Index, which is called Money Talks. And I will be putting one out in the next 24 hours, just to reflect on the transfer window just gone, and also to look ahead to the season from a finance perspective. So, you know, that is something that I put out just to help football fans, Liverpool fans especially, get a better understanding of the finance side of things, because increasingly these days, fans want to know about how everything works in football, not just about what goes on the pitch. And so I try and do my bit just to help fans get a better idea about how things work in terms of the numbers side of things.
It's fantastic. Like, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, I've followed you for years and we've interacted over Twitter a few times. So thank you. I've always found like your insight absolutely tremendous. So thank you for that. But this has been the Room podcast, the podcast brought to you by LFC Transfer Room. There is a slight game coming up, the Merseyside derby. You might have heard of it. We will obviously look forward to that too, and hopefully it can be another 9-0 drubbing, or at least a Liverpool win. let's go for that. But thank you for everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for Alex, my co-host, who's joined too. But a massive thanks to Mo. You've been phenomenal. But from now, and as always, take care, everybody, and up the Reds.